My name is Zora, and I learned that some songs are worth dying for on the day Silas Hartwell decided my voice was too dangerous to let live. The morning sun was beating down merciless on the cotton fields of Magnolia Creek Plantation when I made the choice that would change everything, leading the other field hands in the old song my grandmother taught me, the one that carried messages of hope and resistance in its ancient African rhythms. I had been singing that song my whole life. 25 years of letting my voice rise above the endless rows of white cotton that stretched to the horizon like a sea of bondage. But that morning was different. I could feel the weight of despair pressing down on my people like a physical thing, heavy and suffocating after the news that 3 more families had been sold away the day before, children torn from mothers, husbands separated from wives, all to pay Master Crawford's gambling debts. So I opened my mouth and let the song pour out, my voice strong and clear as church bells ringing across the field, calling my people back to hope, back to remembering who we were before the chains, before the whips, before the endless cycle of planting and picking that defined our days from sunrise to sunset. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. The other voices joined mine one by one, rising like a choir of angels trapped in hell, old Josiah's bass rumbling beneath the melody, young Mary's soprano soaring above it. Dozens of voices blending into something beautiful and powerful and absolutely forbidden on a plantation where silence was golden and songs were seen as seeds of rebellion. I knew Silas Hartwell was watching from his horse at the edge of the field. Could feel his pale blue eyes boring into me with the hatred he reserved for anything that gave us joy or comfort or connection to each other. But I kept singing anyway, because some things matter more than safety. Some things are worth the price you know you'll have to pay. Hartwell was the kind of overseer who found pleasure in breaking spirits. A man who measured his success not by how much cotton got picked, but by how thoroughly he could crush any spark of humanity in the people under his control. He had pale skin that burned red in the Georgia sun and thin lips that never smiled, except when he was inflicting pain. His whip hung from his belt like a snake coiled and ready to strike. I watched him dig his spurs into his horse's flanks and ride toward me, his face twisted with the particular fury he saved for moments when someone dared to act like a human being instead of livestock. But I didn't stop singing, didn't lower my voice or look away. I met his eyes and sang louder, stronger, pouring every ounce of defiance I possessed into those sacred words. Wade in the water. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Shut your mouth, girl. Hartwell's voice cracked like his whip, sharp and vicious as he pulled his horse up beside me, but I kept singing, kept my eyes locked on his, letting him see that I wasn't afraid, that I would never be afraid of a man who had to hurt others. To feel powerful, the song died on the lips of the other workers as they saw Hartwell's hand move to his whip, fear replacing hope in their eyes as they recognized the signs of violence about to explode. But I sang on alone, my voice the only sound in a field suddenly gone silent except for the whisper of wind through cotton bolls. Wade in the water. Gods. Gonna trouble the water. Hartwell's whip came down across my shoulders before I could finish the verse, the leather cutting through my thin dress like it was made of paper. Fire exploding across my back as the first blow landed, but I didn't scream, didn't give him the satisfaction of hearing my pain. Just gritted my teeth and kept the melody going in my head, even if I couldn't force it past my lips anymore. You think you're some kind of leader, is that it? Hartwell snarled, his whip rising again. Think you can fill these others with your rebellious nonsense, and I won't notice? Well, I got news for you, girl. There ain't gonna be no more singing on my watch, no more of this African devil music stirring up trouble. The second blow caught me across the ribs, wrapping around my body like a burning brand, and this time I did cry out. the sound torn from my throat against my will. But even through the pain, I could see the satisfaction in Hartwell's eyes, the pleasure he took in reducing me from a person who sang to an animal that screamed, "Please, sir." Old Josiah stepped forward, his hat in his hands and his voice carefully respectful. "Miss Zora wasn't meaning no harm. She was just trying to help us work better. You know how music makes the cotton come faster?" Hartwell turned his attention to Josiah with the lazy interest of a cat who spotted a new mouse to torture. "Oh, so you think she was helping, do you? Think there's nothing wrong with filling your heads with songs about water and freedom and all that Underground Railroad nonsense?" The words hit me like another blow. He knew. Somehow he had figured out that the old spirituals weren't just songs, but messages, codes that helped guide runaway slaves to safety. That my grandmother's ancient melodies carried maps to freedom for those brave enough to follow them. "Strip her," Hartwell commanded, his voice cutting through my thoughts like a blade. "Tie her to the punishment tree. It's time everyone on this plantation learned what happens to troublemakers who think they can spread rebellion through song." The punishment tree stood at the center of the quarters, a massive oak that had been used for wood bangs and worse for as long as anyone could remember, its bark scarred with rope burns, its roots watered with the blood and tears of my people. I had seen others tied to that tree, had heard their screams echo through the night, but I had never imagined I would feel those rough ropes cutting into my own wrists too. Of Hartwell's men grabbed my arms and dragged me toward the tree, while the other field hands were forced to watch, their faces twisted with grief and helpless rage, knowing that any attempt to help me would only result in more violence, more punishment, more death. They stripped my dress away with brutal efficiency, leaving me naked and exposed in front of everyone I had ever known. The humiliation almost worse than the anticipation of pain, but I kept my chin up, kept my eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the plantation boundaries, thinking about the song that had brought me to this moment and refusing to regret it. The ropes bit into my wrists as they tied my arms around the tree trunk, the bark rough against my bare skin, scratching and cutting even before the real punishment began. I could hear crying from the watching crowd, could smell the fierce sweat of people who knew they might be next if Hartwell decided to make an example of more than one person. 50 lashes, Hartwell announced, his voice carrying clearly across the silent quarters. 50 lashes for disturbing the peace with rebellious singing. And let this be a lesson to all of you about what happens when you forget your place. 50 lashes enough to kill a person if they were unlucky, enough to leave permanent scars even if they survived. I had seen men never walk right again after half that many, had watched women lose their minds from the pain and never fully come back to themselves. I pressed my cheek against the bark of the punishment tree and thought about my grandmother, about the songs she had taught me and the stories that came with them, about ancestors who had died fighting for freedom and children yet to be born who would need those same songs to guide them home. Count them out. Hartwell ordered one of his men. Count them loud so everyone knows exactly how many lashes rebellion costs. The first blow landed across my shoulder blades with the force of lightning. White hot pain exploding through my body as the whip laid my skin open to the bone. I bit down on my tongue to keep from screaming, tasted blood and determination. In equal measure, one. The second strike crossed the first, creating an X of agony on my back. I could feel blood running down my spine, warm and sticky in the morning heat. But I didn't scream, didn't beg, didn't give Hartwell the satisfaction he was looking for. 2. By the 10th lash, I was hanging limp against the ropes, my legs no longer able to support my weight, my back a mass of torn flesh and exposed muscle. But somewhere deep inside, I was building something new from the pain, something hard and sharp, and hungry for revenge. 10. By the 20th, I had stopped feeling the individual blows. My whole body one continuous scream of agony, but my mind was crystal clear, memorizing every detail of this moment, every face in the crowd, every word from Hartwell's mouth, storing it all away for the day when I would make him pay. 20. Somewhere around the 30th lash, I started to fade, darkness creeping in around the edges of my vision, but I fought to stay conscious, fought to remember, because forgetting would mean Hartwell had won, would mean my suffering had been for nothing. 30. I don't remember the last 20 lashes, don't remember being cut down from the tree or carried back to my cabin. My next clear memory is waking up 3 days later on my stomach, my back on fire, and my mouth full of the taste of revenge, sweet and bitter and absolutely certain. Old Sarah was sitting beside my bed, dabbing at my wounds with cool water and tears streaming down her weathered face. "Child," she whispered when she saw my eyes open. "Child, we thought we'd lost you, thought that devil had finally killed someone with his cruelty." "Not dead," I croaked, my voice barely recognizable even to myself, raw and damaged from screaming. "Not dead yet, and when I'm healed, when I'm strong again, Silas Hartwell is gonna learn what happens when you try to silence a song that's been singing for centuries." Sarah's eyes widened with fear and something that might have been hope. "What are you saying, child? What are you planning?" "Justice," I whispered, the word tasting like blood and promise on my tongue. "I'm planning justice, and when I'm done with him, Silas Hartwell won't never hurt another soul." As I lay therein, the darkness of my cabin, feeling my wounds throb with every heartbeat, I began to plan, began to think about the songs my grandmother had taught me. The ones about more than just escape, the ones about fighting back, about making your enemies pay for every drop of blood they spilled. Silas Hartwell thought he had broken me, thought 50 lashes would silence my voice forever, but he was wrong. What he had really done was forge my spirit into something harder than steel, sharper than any weapon, and more dangerous than he could possibly imagine. The song he tried to silence was still playing in my head, but now it had new words about revenge and retribution and the price that evil men pay when they finally meet their match. I would sing it again someday, but when I did, it would be the last thing Silas Hartwell ever heard. The fever came on the 4th day, burning through my body like hellfire as infection set into the deeper wounds where Hartwell's whip had cut. Clean through to muscle and bone, for 6 days I hovered between life and death, while my back festered and my mind wandered through landscapes of pain and rage. That no living person should ever have to visit old Sarah never left my side during those dark days. Spooning broth into my mouth when I was conscious enough to swallow, cleaning my wounds with salt water that made me scream until my voice gave out completely, whispering prayers over my broken body while the other women from the quarters took turns sitting vigil. "You gotta fight, child," Sarah murmured on the 7th night when my breathing had gotten so shallow everyone thought I was slipping away. "You got something important to do yet, something that Devil Hartwell needs to answer for. You can't go to your rest until you see it through." Her words pulled me back from whatever dark place I was drifting toward, reminded me that dying now would mean Hartwell had won, would mean his cruelty had succeeded in silencing not just my voice, but my spirit. And I couldn't let that happen, wouldn't let him claim that victory. The fever broke on the 8th day, leaving me weak as a newborn, but clear-headed for the first time since the whipping. I could think again, could plan, could feel the cold fire of revenge burning steady and bright in my chest where love and hope used to live. "How long?" I whispered to Sarah, my voice still raw but stronger than it had been. How long was I out of my head? 8 days, child, 8 long days when we thought the Lord was calling you home, she replied, her relief evident in every word. "But you're back now, back with us where you belong." "I'm back," I agreed, though I knew I wasn't the same person who had been tied to that tree. Something fundamental had changed during those days of fever and pain, something that had transformed my love for my people into hatred for their oppressors, and I got work to do. It took 3 more weeks for my back to heal enough for me to sit up without screaming. 3 weeks of lying on my stomach while my flesh knitted itself back together into a landscape of scars that would mark me for the rest of my life. But every day I grew stronger. Every day my hatred grew more focused, and Precise Hartwell came by twice during my recovery, standing in the doorway of my cabin with a smile that made my skin crawl, gloating over his handiwork like an artist admiring a particularly successful painting. "How you feeling, girl?" he asked during his second visit, his voice dripping with false concern. "Learning anything about the consequences of stirring up trouble with your singing?" I kept my eyes closed and my breathing even, pretending to be asleep while I memorized the sound of his footsteps, the rhythm of his breathing, the exact tone of his voice when he thought no one was listening. All details I would need when the time came for payback. "Good," he continued, apparently satisfied that I was unconscious. "Maybe now you'll think twice before filling these others with your rebellious nonsense. Maybe now you understand that I'm the one with the power here, not you and your African devil songs." After he left, I opened my eyes and met Sarah's worried gaze, seeing in her face the same mixture of fear and understanding that I felt in my own heart. We both knew that Hartwell's victory was temporary, that men like him always pushed too far and eventually found themselves face to face with someone who wouldn't be pushed anymore. "What you thinking about so hard, child?" Sarah asked, though I suspected she already knew the answer. "I'm thinking about the stories my grandmother used to tell," I replied, my voice steady despite the rage burning in my chest. "The ones about what happens to slavers and overseers who get too comfortable with their cruelty, about how their own evil eventually comes back to destroy them. Those are dangerous thoughts," Sarah warned, though she didn't sound like she disagreed with them. "Dangerous thoughts that could get you killed if the wrong person hears them." "I'm already supposed to be dead," I pointed out, shifting carefully to ease the pressure on my healing wounds. "Hartwell gave me 50 lashes expecting to bury me afterward. So everything from here on out is borrowed time. Time I intend to use for something that matters." By the 6th week, I was strong enough to sit outside my cabin in the evenings, watching the sun set over the cotton fields while I planned the destruction of the man who had tried to break me. I studied the patterns of his daily routine, the times when he was alone and vulnerable, the places where an accident might befall a cruel overseer who had made too many enemies. The other field hands treated me differently now, with a mixture of respect and fear that I found both gratifying and isolating. They saw the scars on my back when I changed my bandages, saw the way pain had carved new lines in my face and hardened my eyes. And they recognized that something had died in me during those 50 lashes, something that had been replaced by something much more dangerous. "You ain't the same," young Marcus observed one evening when he brought me my dinner, his voice careful and uncertain. "You got a look about you now, like you're seeing things the rest of us can't see." "I'm seeing justice," I replied, my voice carrying a certainty that made him step back. "I'm seeing the day when every person on this plantation who's ever lifted a hand against us gets exactly what they deserve. That's God's work," Marcus said nervously. "Vengeance belongs to the Lord, not to us. Maybe God's too busy to handle it personally," I suggested, my tone conversational but my meaning clear. "Maybe he's looking for someone willing to do his work for him, someone who's got nothing left to lose and everything to gain." The truth was that I had already begun my preparation, using my position as an invalid to observe and listen in ways I never could when I was working in the fields. I learned which guards drank too much and fell asleep at their posts, which overseers had gambling debts that made them desperate, which of the house slaves might be willing to help someone seeking justice against their oppressors. Most importantly, I learned Hartwell's weaknesses, his habits, his fears, the drinking problem that made him careless after dark, the gambling addiction that took him away from the plantation twice a week for card games in town, the isolation that came from being hated by everyone under his authority. I also learned about the punishment tree itself, about its history and significance, about the way ropes behaved when they were tied to its branches, about how much weight those branches could support before they bent or broke. Knowledge that would prove crucial when the time came to turn that symbol of oppression into an instrument of justice. "You're planning something?" Sarah said one night when she thought I was asleep, her voice heavy with worry and resignation. "Something that's gonna get you killed, and probably take some of the rest of us with you. I'm planning to balance the scales." I replied without opening my eyes, to make sure that tree gives back some of the pain it's taken over the years. To show every overseer and master in Georgia what happens when you push people too far. And after, Sarah asked, "What happens to you after you get your revenge? What kind of life do you think you'll have when you're done destroying everything you touch?" It was a fair question, one I had been asking myself during the long hours of pain and planning. The truth was that I didn't expect to survive whatever. I was planning, didn't really care about having a life afterward, as long as I could ensure that Hartwell never hurt anyone else the way he had hurt me. "Some things are more important than staying alive," I said finally. "Some things are worth dying for. And making sure that man never raises a whip against another human being is one of them. Your grandmother's songs," Sarah said suddenly, her voice thoughtful. "The ones you used to sing in the fields, they weren't just about escaping, were they? Some of them were about fighting back." I opened my eyes and looked at her in the dim light of the oil lamp, seeing understanding dawn in her weathered features. She told me stories, I admitted, stories about what our people did to slavers who went too far, about how the spirits of the ancestors sometimes worked through the living to balance the scales of justice. "And you think you're one of those spirits now?" Sarah said, though it wasn't really a question. "I think I'm what happens when you try to break someone who refuses to stay broken," I replied, my voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "I think I'm what 50 lashes and a punishment tree create when they fail to kill the thing they're trying to destroy." Over the next 2 weeks, I gradually returned to work in the fields, moving slowly and carefully, but demonstrating that I was healing, that Hartwell's attempt to destroy me had failed. I could see the frustration in his eyes when he looked at me, the anger that his ultimate punishment hadn't produced the complete submission he was looking for, but I was careful to appear properly chastened, keeping my head down and my voice silent, never giving him any excuse to tie me to that tree again. At least not until I was ready to turn the tables and show him what it felt like to face justice at the end of a rope. The scars on my back served as a constant reminder of what I had endured and what I intended to accomplish. Every morning when I dressed, I felt the raised ridges of healed flesh. Every night when I lay down, I felt the ache of muscles that would never be quite right again. And every moment in between, I planned perfect revenge against the man who had marked me so permanently. I began to sing again, but quietly, almost under my breath, songs that sounded like spirituals but carried different messages. Songs about Judgment Day and rivers running red, about trees bearing strange fruit and men reaping exactly what they had sown. The other workers heard these new songs and understood what they meant, understood that something was coming that would change everything. Hartwell noticed the change in the mood of the fields, the way conversation stopped when he approached, the way eyes followed him with barely concealed hatred, the way even the most submissive workers seemed to be waiting for something, but he didn't understand what he was seeing. Didn't recognize the signs of a reckoning approaching. "Seems like that whipping didn't teach you people the lesson I intended," he said one afternoon, riding his horse through the cotton rows while we worked. Seems like you're still harboring rebellious thoughts despite the example I made. Nobody answered him, but I could feel the attention of every person in that field, could sense them waiting to see what I would do. Whether I would provoke another confrontation or continue to bide my time until the moment was right, I kept picking cotton, kept my eyes down, kept my mouth shut, but inside I was smiling because Hartwell had no idea that his lesson had been learned perfectly, that I understood exactly what he was capable of and was preparing to demonstrate that two could play the game of. Violence and intimidation, the perfect opportunity came 2 weeks later. On a moonless night when Hartwell would be returning late from his weekly card game in town, drunk and careless and completely unprepared for what was waiting for him in the darkness. Beneath the punishment tree, the opportunity I had been waiting for came on a Tuesday night in September when the moon was dark and Hartwell's gambling fever was running particularly high. I knew from listening to the house slaves gossip that he had been losing steadily for weeks, that his desperation was making him stay later at the card tables, drink more heavily, and take bigger risks both at the poker table and on his solitary. Rides back to the plantation I had spent months preparing for this night, learning every inch of the path between the main road and Hartwell's quarters, timing how long it took him to ride from the gate to the overseer's house, noting which spots offered the best concealment and the quickest escape routes. Everything had to be perfect because I would only get one chance. The punishment tree stood in the center of the quarters like a monument to suffering. It's massive, trunk scarred by decades of ropes and chains, its branches thick enough to support the weight of a man, its roots fed by the blood and tears of my people. Tonight it would finally serve a different purpose. Tonight it would become an instrument of justice instead of oppression I had been singing differently for weeks. Using the old codes my grandmother taught me, but with new meanings. Songs that sounded like spirituals to Hartwell and his men, but carried detailed instructions to the other slaves, plans for alibis and diversions, warnings about what was coming and how to stay safe when it happened. Wade in the water, children. I sang softly as I worked, but now the words meant something different. Now they were telling my people to stay in their cabins tonight, to keep their heads down and their mouths shut no matter what they heard, to let the spirits of their ancestors work through me without interference. Old Josiah understood first, his eyes meeting mine across the cotton rows with a mixture of fear and something that might have been pride. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then began humming the melody himself, passing the message along to the others without words, letting them know that tonight was the night their suffering would be answered. By sunset, the whole quarter knew what was coming, though none of them knew the details. They understood that I had been planning something since the day of my whipping, that my apparent submission had been a mask hiding something much more dangerous, and they were ready to provide whatever cover I needed. I waited in my cabin until well past midnight, listening to the sounds of the plantation settling into sleep, the guards making their rounds, the house slaves finishing their evening duties, the various noises that marked the passage of time from dusk to deep night. Everything had to be timed perfectly, or my plan would fail. The rope I needed hung in the barn where they kept the punishment supplies. 50 feet of thick hemp that had been used to tie countless victims to the tree over the years. It seemed fitting that the same rope that had bound so many of my people would be the instrument of Hartwell's destruction. Getting to the barn required crossing 2 open spaces where the guards might see me, but I had been studying their patterns for months, knew exactly when they would be at the far end of their patrol route, how long I had before they returned. I moved like a ghost through the shadows, my bare feet silent on the packed earth. Rope was heavier than I expected, its coils awkward to carry without making noise, but I managed to get it to the punishment tree without being seen, then climbed into the lower branches to prepare the noose, my fingers working by feel in the darkness, creating the knot my grandmother had taught me when I was just a child. She had told me it was important knowledge, that someday I might need to know how to tie a proper hanging knot. I had thought she was teaching me about suicide, about how to escape slavery if life became unbearable, but now I understood she had been preparing me for this moment, for the night when I would use her knowledge to deliver justice. The noose hung from the punishment tree like a dark flower blooming in the moonless night, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it, perfectly positioned to catch Hartwell when he rode beneath the branches on his way home from town. The sight of it filled me with savage satisfaction. The first taste of the revenge I had been planning for so long. I climbed down from the tree and took my position in the shadows, close enough to act when the moment came, but far enough away to avoid being caught in the initial struggle. My heart was beating so hard I was afraid it could be heard across the entire plantation, but my hands were steady and my purpose was clear. The sound of hoofbeats on the main road reached me just after 2 in the morning, uneven and stumbling, the rhythm of a horse carrying a drunk rider. I pressed myself deeper into the shadows and listened as the sounds grew closer. Hartwell, returning from another night of losing money he couldn't afford to lose, he was singing as he rode. Some bawdy tavern song that echoed across the quiet plantation, his voice slurred and careless, completely unaware that his final moments were approaching, that the tree he had used to terrorize my people was about to claim him as its last victim. The horse stopped just outside the quarters, probably sensing something wrong, though Hartwell was too drunk to notice its nervousness. I could hear him cursing as he tried to dismount, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated, perfect for what I had planned. Easy, girl, he slurred to his horse, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. Just a little further and we'll both get some rest, though I suppose you've had an easier night than me. Haven't lost a week's wages to a bunch of cheating riverboat gamblers. He stumbled forward on foot, leading his horse toward the stable, his path taking him directly beneath the punishment tree where my noose was waiting. Everything was falling into place exactly as I had envisioned. Justice approaching with the inevitability of sunrise asterisk, I began to sing very softly the old song that had gotten me whipped in the first place. But now the words carried different meaning. Now they were a death song for the man who had tried to silence me forever. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Hartwell stopped at the sound of my voice, his head turning toward the shadows where I was hidden, confusion and anger warring on his drunken features. "Who's there?" he called out, his hand moving instinctively toward his whip. "What fool is singing at this hour?" I stepped out of the shadows, letting him see me clearly in the starlight. Watching recognition dawn on his face, followed immediately by rage. "You?" he snarled. "I should have known it would be you. Still causing trouble even after I taught you what happens to rebellious singing. You taught me something." I agreed, my voice calm and steady, "but maybe not what you intended. Maybe you taught me that some songs are worth any price, and some men deserve to face the music for their cruelty. Get back to your cabin before I decide to give you another." 50 lashes, Hartwell commanded, but there was something uncertain in his voice now, some recognition that the situation was not what it appeared to be. "I don't think he'll be giving anyone any more lashes," I replied, stepping closer to him, close enough to smell the whiskey on his breath and see the confusion in his eyes. "I think your whipping days are over, along with everything else." "What are you talking about, girl?" Hartwell demanded, his hand now fully gripping his whip. "What kind of fool nonsense are you spouting?" "Look up," I said simply, pointing toward the branches above his head. Hartwell tilted his head back and saw the noose hanging from the punishment tree. The same tree where he had nearly killed me, the same branches he had used to terrorize generations of my people. For a moment he just stared, his drunken mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "You're crazy," he whispered, backing away from the tree. "Completely insane if you think you can threaten me. Do you have any idea what will happen to you if you lay a hand on a white?" "Man, I have a pretty good idea," I admitted. "But I also know what happened to me when you laid a whip on a woman who was just trying to give her people a little hope. And I decided that what happens to me isn't as important as what happens to you." I had been moving while we talked, circling around to cut off his retreat, herding him back toward the tree and the noose that was waiting for him. He was drunk and confused and suddenly very afraid, all his usual confidence evaporating as he realized he was no longer the one in control. "Help." He screamed, his voice breaking with panic. "Somebody help me. There's a crazy slave trying to kill me." But no help came, because everyone who might have heard him had been warned to stay in their cabins, warned not to interfere with what was about to happen. The plantation was silent except for the sound of his breathing and mine, the darkness, broken only by starlight and the gleam of justice finally arriving. 50 lashes, I said, my voice carrying all the pain and rage I had been storing up for months. 50 lashes for singing a song, for trying to give my people a moment of hope and connection to something bigger than their suffering. I was doing my job. Hartwell protested, backing against the trunk of the punishment tree, maintaining order, keeping discipline. If I didn't punish rebellion, it would spread like wildfire. And now I'm doing mine, I replied, grabbing the end of the rope and fashioning a quick slip knot, maintaining balance, keeping justice, making sure that cruelty gets exactly what it deserves. The noose dropped over his head before he could react, the rope settling around his neck with a whisper of hemp against skin. His eyes went wide with terror as he realized what was happening, that the woman he had tried to break was about to break him in return. "Please," he whispered, his arrogance finally cracking. "Completely. Please, I have a family, children who need their father. You can't do this. You can't kill me. You should have thought about families before you started tearing them apart," I said, pulling the rope tight. "Should have thought about children before you whipped their mothers bloody. Should have thought about consequences before you decided to play God with other people's lives." "I'll change," he gasped, clawing at the rope around his neck. "I'll be different. I'll treat everyone better. Just please don't do this. Too late." "For that," I replied, though part of me almost believed he meant it. Way too late for promises and pleas. This is what happens when you push people past the point where they care about consequences. I began to pull on the other end of the rope, slowly lifting Hartwell off his feet, watching his face turn red, then purple, as the noose tightened around his throat. His legs kicked frantically, searching for purchase that wasn't there. His hands clawed at the rope, but couldn't find enough grip to loosen it. "Wade in the water," I sang softly as he strangled. "Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water." It took longer than I expected for him to die. Longer for his struggles to weaken and finally stop. Longer for his body to hang limp and still from the punishment tree that had claimed so many of my people over the years. But eventually it was over. Eventually justice was served. I stood beneath the tree for a long time, looking up at Hartwell's body swaying gently in the night breeze, feeling a satisfaction so deep it was almost spiritual. The man who had tried to silence my voice forever had been silenced himself. The tree that had been a symbol of oppression had finally claimed its oppressor. Tomorrow there would be consequences. Investigations, probably my own death, but tonight there was just justice, pure and simple and long overdue. Tonight the scales were balanced and the song of resistance was stronger than ever. I began to walk back toward my cabin, leaving Hartwell hanging from the punishment tree for others too. Fine in the morning. My work was done. My grandmother's songs had been honored. And for the first time since that terrible day of 50 lashes, I felt something approaching peace dawn broke over Magnolia Creek Plantation with screams that could be heard for miles. The cook's girl had discovered Hartwell's body swaying from the punishment tree when she went to fetch water from the well, and her shrieks brought everyone running. Slaves and masters alike converging on the quarters to witness the impossible sight of their tormentor hanging dead from the same tree. He had used to terrorize them. I was sitting on my cabin steps when the commotion started, calmly braiding my hair and humming the old songs my grandmother had taught me, watching the chaos unfold with the detached interest of someone who had already made peace with whatever consequences might come. The satisfaction I felt at seeing Hartwell's lifeless form hanging from that accursed tree was deeper than any emotion I had ever experienced. Master Crawford arrived within minutes, his face pale with shock and fury as he stared up at his overseer's corpse. Behind him came Dr. Whitman and Sheriff Morgan, both men grim-faced and already asking questions about who could have done such a thing, who would have been bold enough to murder a white man on a plantation where such an act meant certain death. Cut him down, Crawford ordered, his voice shaking with rage. Cut him down and find out who did this. I want every slave on this plantation questioned until someone confesses. But even as they lowered Hartwell's body from the tree, I could see the uncertainty in their eyes, the growing realization that this wasn't a random act of violence, but something planned and executed with careful precision. The noose had been tied with expert skill, the timing had been perfect, and most disturbing of all, not a single slave seemed shocked or horrified by what they were seeing. Strange thing, Sheriff Morgan observed, studying the faces of the assembled crowd. Usually when something like this happens, people are scared, upset, but look at these faces. They don't look surprised. They look almost satisfied. He was right. Of course, my people were struggling to hide their joy at seeing their tormentor dead. Decades of hatred and fear were giving way to something like celebration, though they were careful not to let it show too openly. They understood that appearing too happy about Hartwell's death would only bring suspicion down on their heads. Someone knows something, Crawford declared, his eyes scanning the crowd with growing desperation. Someone saw something, heard something. I want everyone questioned separately until we get answers. The questioning began immediately, but it was futile from the start. My people had learned long ago how to keep secrets from white men, how to look innocent while harboring the most dangerous thoughts, how to protect each other from consequences that could destroy entire families. Every person they asked gave the same response. They had been asleep in their cabins, had heard nothing unusual, knew nothing about who might have wanted Hartwell dead. What about her? Dr. Whitman said suddenly, pointing directly at me. What about the one he went for singing? She'd have reason to want revenge. All eyes turned to me then, and I felt the weight of their suspicion like a physical thing. But I had been preparing for this moment for months, had practiced my responses until they felt natural, had constructed an alibi that would be impossible to disprove. I was in my cabin all night. I said quietly, keeping my voice steady and my eyes downcast, sleeping like always. My back still pains me something fierce when I don't get enough rest. Anyone see you there? Sheriff Morgan demanded. Anyone who can vouch for your whereabouts? Sarah was with me, I replied, gesturing toward the old woman who had nursed me back to health. She comes by most nights to check on my bandages, make sure the wounds ain't getting infected again. Sarah nodded confirmation, her face a mask of concerned innocence. That's right, sir. I was there until well past midnight, helping her with the medicine for her back. She was in terrible pain and couldn't hardly move, let alone go anywhere. It was a lie, of course. But it was a lie that Sarah had agreed to tell weeks ago when I first explained what I was planning. She understood that sometimes justice required deception, that protecting the person who had delivered righteous vengeance was more important than telling white men the truth. Search her cabin, Crawford ordered. Search all the cabins, look for anything that might connect someone to this murder, but they found nothing. Because there was nothing to find, I have been careful to leave no evidence, no rope fibers under my fingernails, no mud on my feet, no signs that I had ever left my cabin during the night. The only proof of my guilt was the satisfaction in my heart, and that was something they could never search for or confiscate. The investigation continued for days, with officials from the county coming to interview witnesses and examine the scene. But it was clear that they were making no progress. The wall of silence surrounding Hartwell's death was impenetrable, built from decades of shared suffering and mutual protection. This is what happens, I heard Crawford tell Dr. Whitman one afternoon. This is what happens when you let them think they can get away with defiance. When you don't crush every spark of rebellion the moment it appears. Maybe, Dr. Whitman replied thoughtfully, or maybe this is what happens when you let an overseer get too brutal, too careless with his power. Hartwell had a reputation, Thomas. Everyone knew he was crueler than necessary. Are you saying he deserved what happened to him? Crawford demanded, his voice rising with indignation. I'm saying that when you treat people like animals, eventually one of them might decide to bite back, Dr. Whitman replied calmly. And when that happens, you can't really be surprised. Their conversation gave me hope that perhaps the investigation would eventually be abandoned, that the authorities would decide Hartwell's death was an inevitable consequence of his own cruelty rather than a crime. That needed to be solved, but I knew better than to relax my guard. Knew that powerful men didn't like to admit their system could produce such spectacular failures. 3 weeks after the murder, Sheriff Morgan made one final attempt to break the conspiracy of silence that protected me, gathering all the slaves in the quarters and announcing that anyone who provided information leading to the killer's capture would be rewarded with freedom and safe passage north. Think about it, he urged, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. Freedom for yourself and your family, a chance to start over somewhere safe. All you have to do is tell us what you know about who killed Silas Hartwell. The silence that greeted his offer was absolute and telling. Not one person stepped forward. Not one voice broke the solidarity that had protected me since the night of my revenge. They understood that some victories were worth more than individual freedom, that seeing their tormentor receive justice was payment enough for their continued bondage. No one, Sheriff Morgan said in amazement, not one of you is willing to trade information for freedom. That's remarkable. Maybe they don't know nothing, Crawford suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. Maybe whoever did this was smart enough to work alone. Or maybe, Sheriff Morgan replied, they know exactly who did it, and they're protecting them because they think justice was served. That afternoon, Sheriff Morgan came to my cabin alone, settling heavily in the chair across from where I was mending a torn dress, his eyes studying my face with the intensity of a man trying to read a difficult book. You know, Zora, he said conversationally, I've been a lawman for 23 years, and in all that time, I've never seen a community close ranks quite like this. It's almost like you people consider whoever killed Hartwell to be a hero rather than a murderer. Wouldn't know nothing about that, I replied, keeping my attention focused on my sewing. I just know that Mr. Hartwell was a hard man who made a lot of enemies, hard enough to deserve hanging. Sheriff Morgan asked, his question casual but loaded with implications. That ain't for me to say, I replied carefully. Judging white folks ain't something people like me are supposed to do. But if you could judge, he pressed, if you were allowed to have an opinion about whether Silas Hartwell got what he deserved, what would that opinion be? I looked up from my sewing then, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since the questioning began, letting him see something of the steel that lived behind my careful mask of submission. I'd say that tree has seen a lot of suffering over the years, I said quietly, and maybe it was time for it to see some justice instead. Sheriff Morgan stared at me. For a long moment, and I could see understanding dawn in his weathered features, the realization that he was looking at the person responsible for Hartwell's death, the woman who had turned victim into executioner with careful planning and perfect timing. "You're never going to confess," he said finally. "Are you?" "Confess to what?" I asked innocently. "To being whipped near to death for singing. To spending weeks recovering from wounds that should have killed me. To surviving when a brutal man tried to break my spirit. To murder," he said bluntly, "to taking the law into your own hands and executing a man who wronged you." "The law," I repeated, my voice carrying a note of bitter amusement. What law protects people like me from people like him? What court would listen to my complaints about being whipped for singing? What justice was I supposed to seek when the system itself is designed to keep me powerless? "So you made your own justice?" Sheriff Morgan said, and there was something almost like admiration in his voice. "I survived. I corrected him. I healed. I learned. And I made sure that what happened to me would never happen to anyone else. If that's justice, then I suppose I did make my own. And you'd do it again?" He asked. "If you had to, I'd do whatever was necessary." "To protect my people from men who think cruelty is their right?" I replied without hesitation. "I'd do whatever it took to make sure that tree never claims another innocent victim." Sheriff Morgan stood to leave then, his investigation officially over, even though we both knew he had found his killer. "You know they'll bring in a new overseer," he said from the doorway. "Probably someone even worse than Hartwell." "Maybe," I agreed, "but he'll know what happened to the last one, and maybe that knowledge will make him think twice before he gets too comfortable with his whip. And if it doesn't," he asked, "then maybe he'll end up keeping Hartwell company," I replied, my voice carrying a promise that made him pause. "You're a dangerous woman." "Zora," Sheriff Morgan said finally. "No," I corrected him. "I'm a free woman, even if the law don't recognize it yet, and free women protect themselves and their people by whatever means necessary." After he left, I sat on my cabin steps and began to sing, softly at first, but growing stronger as other voices joined mine. The same song that had gotten me whipped, the same melody that had carried me through 50 lashes and weeks of planning. Revenge, but now the song carried new meaning. Now it was a victory hymn, a celebration of justice served and power reclaimed. Now it was proof that some spirits cannot be broken, no matter how hard the world tries to crush them. The punishment tree still stood in the center of the quarters, but it looked different now, somehow smaller and less threatening, its branches. No longer symbols of oppression, but reminders that even the mightiest weapons can be turned against their wielders when courage and determination meet. Opportunity I never confessed to killing Silas Hartwell, and no one ever proved that I was responsible for his death. But every slave on Magnolia Creek Plantation knew the truth, and they carried that truth with them like a talisman, a reminder that justice sometimes comes from the most unexpected. Sources: the new overseer who replaced Hartwell was a quieter man, more careful with his authority, less quick to reach for his whip when faced with defiance. He had heard the stories about his predecessor's fate, and he understood that some victories come at too high a price to be worth pursuing, and I continued to sing, my voice stronger than ever, carrying messages of hope and resistance to anyone brave enough to listen, because I had learned that some songs are indeed worth dying for, and some deaths are worth living through. The scars on my back healed into raised ridges that I wore like medals, proof that I had faced the worst my oppressors could offer and emerged victorious, proof that love for my people was stronger than fear for myself. Proof that justice delayed is not always justice denied. My name became legend in the quarters, whispered by mothers to their children as an example of what happens when courage meets opportunity. Sung in coded spirituals that carried my story to plantations throughout the South. Remembered as proof that even the most powerless person can find a way to reclaim their strength. I was Zora, The woman who's whipped at the punishment tree for singing, and who returned to hang the overseer, I was living proof that some spirits cannot be broken, some songs cannot be silenced, and some justice cannot be denied.